On today's World Insight, China and the U.S. to double flights per week in the coming months, a sign of cooperation amid tensions. What do more frequent flights between the world's largest economies mean for people exchanges and trade?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. On August 10th, China announced it will let back out Chinese group tours bound for 78 countries, including popular destinations such as Japan, the U.S., and Australia. This, as the U.S. Transportation Department looks to double the flights per week between China and the U.S. in the coming months. Chinese round-trip passenger flights to the U.S. will increase to 18 starting September the 1st and to 24 per week starting October the 29th, up from the current 12. But it seems that the full resumption of air service between the two countries still has a long way to go, since there were an average of 340 flights per week before the pandemic. For more insights, let's loop in our panelists. Joining us from Portland, Professor Yan Liang, the Creamer Chair in Economics from the William Nett University. From Washington, D.C., Surabh Gupta, a Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. From Beijing, Dean Liu Baozheng of the Center for International Business Ethics of the University of International Business and Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, if you look at the real numbers, as we earlier introduced, even with the increased flights between the two countries, is far from the earlier number before the pandemic per week in terms of round-trip flights going between the two countries. Why such a sea difference, even today? Professor Liu, briefly.
Well, one reason is very obviously it is really the long-tail effect of the pandemic, and people seems to be afraid of traveling, and also some of the bureaucrats are also looking at this issue with very high scrutiny. And the other is, of course, the severe relationship between China and some of these countries are there to influence the enthusiasm to further resume the people's contact. And the other is the Ukraine conflict, because all across this region, for example, to travel from Beijing to Washington to New York, etc. So the air curfew is there to disrupt the normal flight that is there to travel through this region and via the North Pole. So, all this really add up. Well, I think lastly is really people have less confidence in their income, both for those investors and consumers. So they are more careful with their own purse.
All right. Professor Yan Liang, you're also an economic professor. Can you help us to understand better about exactly what are the reasons? It seems that many of the reasons Professor Liu mentioned make sense, but still, there's such a huge difference between the numbers now and earlier. There must be something very different.
Right. So I agree with Professor Liu. I do think that it takes time for the normal flight schedules to be resumed as usual. There are political reasons. There are definitely still some, media or the government from the United States that would emphasize, travel safely and be careful if you're going abroad to China, for example. So there are still some concerns, I think, among the people about, resuming the travel to China. There's also economic reasons. I think, after the pandemic, definitely people's income and confidence are low, and so it takes time for them to resume their, long distance travel. Not to mention, I think for businesses, business trips are down this year because investors are still taking the wait and see kind of approach and wait for the moment to come back to China and resume their normal business. But there are also logistic reasons, as Professor Liu also mentioned. In the United States, we know that a lot of domestic flights were were reduced simply because during the pandemic, a lot of staff, a lot of the airplanes were not, in service. So now it's time to recruit and also to restart some of these businesses. So I think for all these political, economic, and logistic reasons, we're seeing a slow increase in the flights, which I think is a right step towards the right direction.
But some argue it's a chicken and egg thing. Whether it is people's desire to travel has been really low right now compared to pre-pandemic time, or because the air tickets are so expensive and also not convenient. Sometimes you have to get connected flights. Earlier there were direct flights. So chicken and egg, how should we tell that story, Mr. Gupta?
Yeah, I agree with what has been said before with regard to some of the reasons. But I think an additional reason is there's real logistical nightmare and lack of real baggage handling capacity at some of these airports. I mean, if one travels international, the lines and the queues sometimes at immigration are very long. It takes, you come into the United States, it'll take even, I'm not talking as a Chinese national trying to enter the US, a US national or a US permanent resident trying to make it through immigration. It takes ages, very long. There are very few customs and border agents out there. Again, because of the pandemic, I mean, we had flights cut, staff laid off. That process has not come back to where it should be. And so I think there's quite a lot of chaos within the airline industry. And my sense is that government is trying to pad up the airlines' bottom lines by actually restricting the amount of flights, having them have larger profits at this point of time, and hopefully will roll out, build out their flight schedules. But yeah, as you said, I mean, 24 flights amounts to nothing, basically, even come October 29th. And I mean, I'm looking for at least 100 flights, and I think there's demand and capacity for that, frankly.
My colleagues were doing some research before we start our conversation. Just give some example. Shortest flights from October 1st to the 7th this year cost anywhere, I mean, talking about China-U.S., nearly 15,000 yuan to more than 37,000 yuan. That's 2,000 to 5,000 US dollars. The same flights in January last year range about 7,300 to 9,600 yuan, which is 1,000 to 1,300 US dollars. So even last year was less expensive. And looking at the same period of time, 2018, return flights from Beijing to San Francisco went as low as 5,000 yuan. That's about 700 US dollars. So I'm sure you guys are traveling between China and the United States like crazy over the years. So I'm sure, the temperature of the water as we speak. So is there a way that the supply will be able to meet the demands? As we know, there are still tens of thousands of Chinese students studying in the United States. There are business people who are eager to travel on issues that they cannot do without meeting face-to-face. And we all know now the quality of meeting face-to-face as a result of 3 years of pandemic. So Professor Liang, do you see that business communities in aviation are interested in this?
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting that you brought up this question about chicken and eggs, and I definitely agree with you. I mean, just based on a personal data point, I'm actually right now sitting in Huizhou City in Guangdong Province in China, and I came back in July, and my ticket's definitely much more expensive than I remember before the pandemic, and also a lot of transits. I actually making 2 stops flying out from Portland to Hong Kong, as a matter of fact. So I agree with you. I think the kinds of hurdles of traveling, the high cost, and also don't forget the backlog of all these visa applications. A lot of these are factors that put people off. But at the same time, I agree with you. I think people still are eager to travel. And as the Chinese embassy in the United States put it, right, these increasing mutual visits between Chinese people and American people are super important. This is the way that we can communicate and interact and really, to rebuild the kind of relationships. So I definitely think for the airlines, they do see the market, they do see the demand. As you mentioned, the price is increasing. It's because there's higher demand than supply. So I definitely think, as soon as, the two sides agree to restore and resume more flights, I think more will be coming down the road, especially for business, for study, for travel, for, family visits. So I'm looking forward to, hopefully, cheaper tickets in the coming years.
I share the same wish with you, shall I say that way, Professor Liang. Mr. Gupta, how shall we make sure, at least to a certain degree, that political rhetorics will not become the obstacles for people to plan their personal travel?
I am hopeful that with the thawing of the relationship that we are seeing, I know there are still a lot of problems in U.S.-China relations. The relationship can go sideways. It can even deteriorate. But that at both ends, there is a desire to just have a basic stability in the relationship and open areas of potential cooperation. That's why we had Secretary Yellen, Mr. Kerry coming, areas where cooperation is very much in the works. And people-to-people travel and contacts is an area which has been talked about both in the Bali document and has been talked since as an area where the two countries can get together. So I am hopeful that that this pipeline will be widened and that there will be more exchanges. And I wouldn't look at this purely through the US-China lens because, again, a personal data point, I was in Japan very recently and oh my God, the tickets are sky high and tremendous delays, 5 hours delay just getting on a flight on an American airline. And so it's not just U.S.-China flights which have been interrupted. It's other flights. I mean, Japan is as strong an ally of the U.S. as could be, and of course also the flight paths have been changed, altered a little bit so that they don't fly over Russian airspace. But that I really don't think amounts to much because when I did track the flight, it's not such a vast difference in the flight track that it should become that much more expensive. So the hope is that with stabilization of the relationship, people-to-people contacts is the next area or the current area which is going to be open for cooperation. It's good to see China allowing the group tours to a place like Japan, to a place like Australia. And I am hopeful that, the airlines will be a little bit more responsible in trying to build their capacity and their staff to be able to take rates to where it used to be previously, or thereabouts, frankly.
Right. Everybody should do their job. Go to you, Professor Liu. How to make sure that some of the important, shall I say, areas of aviation cooperation can still remain between China and the United States as the demand is so strong?
Yes. When you raise the chicken and egg issue, in a market economy, if you see the price is really shooting high, it is always the chicken that's there to blame because, definitely supply that is having a problem. And so now, why the problem? Because number one is really the political impact, the distrust on the political front is are getting more on the decline. And although, after the Bali meeting, there people have been talking about this, to the resumption, but the trust building is really taking a far more long time. And people-to-people exchange is so important. It's not only there to rebuild the confidence, because only when people are there to, shake hands, hug with each other, and talk with each other, even quarrel with each other face to face, that can really enhance people's confidence. And then,
so the question really is very interesting. That is, whether governments are really encouraging traveling.
Exactly.
Or it is only a political statement rather than real implementation. I think that is a question that really needs to be, analyzed at this point.
Yeah,
I'm not just talking about China-U.S., but also on a wider
because
space.
of the distrust, you see that the U.S. raised alarm to many of the U.S. Citizens in those destination countries. And guys, be careful or don't travel to that country because they're going to have regional conflict, or they're going to have, spy or espionage law that you're going to be having trouble. So, they spook people. And so from China's side, China is also having a very strong character towards the rest of the world. If you are really stopping my people, I will stop your people. And good enough. So recently we have really expanded the more of the destinations for Chinese travel on tour basis. So, I think, on the people's level, you can see that a PEW type of investigation is also showing a very gloomy picture about people-to-people's trust between different nations. So therefore, I think, we do need, at the business level, they are there to make money. And at the government level, they need to really to rectify some of the issues that are really fancified. And for people, I think there is definitely a need, both for study, work, and also leisure.
The other thing is about the understanding of how the world works. Of course, the earlier types of globalization seems to be not going to come back very soon, at least, Mr. Gupta. But closing the door or not necessarily encouraging exchanges among countries will certainly not solve the problems that are already existing. So meanwhile, how national economy survive and revive, will that depend on mainly trying to satisfy the demands of domestic demands through domestic solutions, or will it be, still interacting with the rest of the world? I think that is a question facing a lot of countries these days. To what degree you open, and that will be encouraging for the economy and also for the people. Mr. Gupta.
Yes, with regard to the power of globalization, there's of course a lot of talk about how we are deglobalizing, but the power of globalization is still so strong that the waves of globalization will continue and continue, even though it might not be as strong as it was previously. And therefore, trying to box one in within national solutions or with, as the US says, like-minded partners is not going to be a long-term solution. Again, coming back just to this issue of travel, even if one talks in terms of pure national interest, there are going to be a lot of Chinese travelers, more Chinese travelers perhaps going to the United States than US travelers perhaps going to China. It is in the US's own selfish national interest to liberalize tourism. And I think there is an understanding in this regard, because there are so many Chinese students, they're bright, they're brilliant, and the US would actually like them to move on with green cards and become American citizens or become American national or permanent residents and help the US economy. I mean, China will pay for their primary education and the benefits will be gleaned by the United States. So the US understands it's in its own national interest. It's trying to reframe and reshape globalization, but I think at this time there's a little too much arrogance among those who think that they can reshape globalization to their benefit. They will see that that this will boomerang up to a certain not completely, but up to a certain extent in their own faces. So I am more hopeful that even with taking travel as an example, but also wider contacts, people to people and economic exchange, that we are going to see that come back. And it's certain that face-to-face over a screen is just not good enough. Even for, say, track to events, you need the people in person, and that's where we're
I hope next time you can sit in the studio as well, both of you, Ms. Liang and also Mr. Gupta. Having said that, though, of course, all of you touch on China-U.S. relations. What this latest gesture coming from both sides might mean. From the U.S. side, double the flight. From the Chinese side, make sure that the group tourists from China is encouraged to go to all the countries, including to the G7 countries. Of course, the United States included as well. So how do you see these signs, gestures, trying to contribute to a somewhat better ambience, shall we put it this way, since mid this year? Mr. Professor Liu.
Well, the people won't really...
Did I hear alongside from you, Professor?
That's right. I really need to simmer in your word ambience because, yes, for people with strong personality and also even for nation with personality, unless they feel the pain, they don't really normally admit some of the errors they make. So therefore, I think, for the major nations who really suffer from the lack of understanding, lack of interaction, and lack of the income for people-to-people exchange, they now begin to seriously look at this issue. And so therefore, we do see that there's a very slow moving in warming up some of the relationship with the rest of the countries. And right now, the businesses are there still rather weak because normally it is really the business that is driving more of the interaction, from the supply side, and also they are there to hire more of the global employees, etc. But right now, unfortunately, we do not see much enthusiasm, given also the more of the trade sanctions and the blockade between the major economies with China, particularly from the United States. We cannot really see much of a warming sign.
Professor Liang, also to you, we see the visits by the three administration officials coming from the State Department, the Treasury Department, and then the Special Envoy on Climate. Of course, a longtime icon like Dr. Kissinger visiting China and meeting with Chinese president. All of these are widely spread on the news. So how much will appearances like these likely to bring some positive momentum? And leading up to later in August, there were media reports suggesting the Commerce Minister coming from the U.S. might be visiting China. Now, we cannot confirm about that at this moment, but how do you see this is likely to change the ambience a bit? But is it too little too late? Because we know there's going to be the election year next year and things are going to change dramatically.
Right. I don't think it's never too late and too little for this kind of high-level direct communications. I think it's super important for both sides to be able to communicate directly. And I think what you're seeing interestingly right now is, as you mentioned, we're entering in the United States soon the peak political season with the presidential election in 2024. So definitely the anti-China rhetoric is going to be ratcheting up because neither parties wanted to show that they are being soft, quote unquote, to China. But on the other hand, they're really trying to deliver this message that there's no massive efforts to decouple the two economies, but rather de-risking. And that is, of course, open to interpretation. But I do see in the recent, sort of actions by the White House, for example, in the recent ban of the certain U.S. investments in China's tech sectors, you see it's surgically really well, in a way, narrow the sectors in which these investments are scrutinized. And a lot is emphasizing on information gathering and notification. And it doesn't really have any substantive, I would say, impacts because, China does not like capital from the United States. And a lot of these so-called ban of investment is already in some ways curtailed by the earlier, export ban. So I think at the substance level, I do see the US administration is walking the fine line that on the one hand, they are ratcheting up the political rhetoric, but on the other hand, they do not want to have self-inflicting economic wounds by all these policies. They do recognize China is super important as the second largest economy, which occupies very important nodes in the whole green energy, green industry supply chain, going from battery to EVs to wind turbines to solar panels, you name it. And last but not least, I think as both countries want to, make all out efforts to improve the technology and innovations, and China is increasingly becoming the engine of technological innovations, productivity growth. As a matter of fact, not only at the state level, China is increasing R&D spending, but also at the private sector level. They're spending over $278 billion last year on the R&D. And BYD, by the way, has a 70,000 R&D team. So in other words, if the U.S. is really serious about boosting its own strength, it needs to work with China on both climate change and also on the next generation of technological innovations.
Leading up to later this year, we're likely to see some major multilateral events happening. The BRICS coming up later next week. We also see the G20, and in November, APEC, which is going to be held this time in the United States, San Francisco. Usually leaders from the major economies in the APEC region would be there. That could include China and the United States as well. So what kind of opportunity are we talking about right now to lay at least a sound foundation for later interactions, for serious discussions? Mr. Gupta, briefly.
Yeah, I think that it's a very important foundation that is sought to be laid. Right now, the main focus is on getting the tenor of the relationship correct, not with regard to making real progress as such. The U.S. tends to be somewhat transactional. We will cooperate in these areas, but in all other areas we're going to compete, and that can throw the relationship off track because competition can turn into rivalry. And it's the Chinese side which says, let's get the tenor of the relationship right. And I'm glad the U.S. is listening to that and trying to get the tenor right. And then, as you say, with particularly at the APEC meeting in San Francisco, there can be useful deliverables which come out of this. Hopefully by then the Section 301 review that USTR is doing will be over. Maybe they might have some conversations with regard to reducing or removing some of those Section 301 tariffs which are illegal in the first place. But it's useful, as I say, get the tenor right, and then let's have certain exchanges and deliverables, like on the opening flights. There has been movement in terms of the fentanyl issue because it's a pressing issue for the United States. There are working groups which have now being set up in the context of the Bali framework. So the important thing is the relationship must not go sideways. It must not backwards. Let it be slow and steady, but that itself is something worth cherishing at this point of time.
Points taken. Professor Liu, we only have about 40 seconds left for you, please.
Yeah, I think there is really good intention and also good need to de-escalate some of the tensions that has been boiling. And now, from the decoupling to de-risking, and also from managing the commutation to avoid confrontation. So these are really the good signs. But in actuality, we do not really see much of the measures that are being taken. The U.S. is really, talking about the small yard and higher fences, but the fence is getting higher and higher, and the yard is also getting larger and larger. So what I do want to see is really a positive and a concrete move to meet each other in that same direction, where both benefit can be received by people and communities of business.
Liu Baocheng, Saurabh Gupta, last but not least, Yan Liang, thank you so much for joining us. All the best. I hope we can have more optimism based on future interactions. Thank you so much for joining us. That's all the time we have for today. If you want to find us, you can always go to YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook and find me more information about World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.